Friends, thank you for being here today. What if I told you that on October 12th, during what appeared to be a routine address to the International Monetary Fund, Canada's Prime Minister Mark Carney delivered 28 minutes of carefully calibrated economic policy that systematically dismantled 75 years of American financial dominance? And what if I told you that this speech, dismissed by American economists as standard Canadian fiscal conservatism, contained a comprehensive strategy for ending dollar hegemony, redirecting global capital flows, and establishing Canada as the world's primary financial safe haven, while American economic dreams collapsed into mathematical impossibility? This is not how financial empires announce their succession plans. The speech was scheduled during the Monetary Policy Coordination Panel, positioned between presentations on inflation targeting and sustainable development financing. Carney had been expected to deliver predictable remarks about fiscal responsibility and international cooperation. Instead, he used those 28 minutes to systematically deconstruct the assumptions that support American economic supremacy, while offering detailed alternatives that would permanently end American financial leadership. Most delegates were reviewing their phones or preparing for lunch breaks. Revolution was unfolding 3 seats away from them, and they were thinking about dinner reservations. I've studied the transcript, analyzed the immediate market reactions, and traced the cascade of institutional responses that followed. What I discovered is the most sophisticated financial warfare strategy ever deployed by a developed nation, a comprehensive plan that transforms Canada from an American economic satellite into the gravitational center of international finance. The world thought this was about Canadian monetary policy initiatives. They were witnessing the engineering of American economic obsolescence. Carney's strategy emerged from recognition that American financial dominance rests on 4 foundational assumptions that had never been systematically challenged by a major ally. First, that the US dollar would remain the preferred reserve currency due to American economic stability and military guarantees. Second, that American capital markets would continue providing the most efficient mechanisms for international investment and corporate financing. Third, that American financial institutions would maintain their advantages in international banking and trade finance. Fourth, that American economic policy would determine global financial conditions through Federal Reserve decisions and Treasury Department actions. Each assumption had become vulnerable due to American political dysfunction, fiscal irresponsibility, and strategic overextension that had accumulated over decades of unchallenged hegemony. Carney recognized that systematic challenges to these assumptions could create alternatives that would make American financial leadership optional rather than necessary. The first component of Carney's strategy appeared as a technical proposal for improving international monetary coordination. He announced the creation of the Stability Reserve Mechanism, describing it as a multilateral system for managing exchange rate volatility and providing emergency liquidity during financial crises. What he actually announced was the world's first comprehensive alternative to dollar-based international finance. The Stability Reserve Mechanism would pool resources from major economies, excluding the United States, to provide currency stability, trade financing, and emergency lending that would eliminate international dependence on American financial systems. The mechanism operates through a basket of currencies weighted according to economic stability, fiscal responsibility, and political predictability, rather than military power or historical dominance. Canada, due to its resource wealth, fiscal conservatism, and political stability, would hold the largest allocation in the reserve system, while the US dollar would be excluded entirely. Countries participating in the mechanism gain access to currency swap arrangements, trade financing facilities, and emergency lending programs that provide all the services of American-dominated institutions without the political conditions, economic pressures, or policy restrictions that American financial leadership typically imposes. The mathematical implications were immediately obvious to central bank governors, who understood that reserve currency status depends on network effects rather than economic fundamentals. Once enough major economies participate in alternative reserve mechanisms, the dollar loses its privileged position through purely mechanical displacement rather than economic competition. The second component was even more sophisticated. Carney announced the launch of the Sustainable Development Finance Initiative, framing it as a Canadian-led effort to mobilize private capital for environmental and infrastructure projects in developing economies. This was actually a comprehensive strategy for capturing international development finance markets that American institutions had dominated since the Bretton Woods system. The initiative would provide project financing, infrastructure investment, and development lending that would replace World Bank programs, International Monetary Fund assistance, and American commercial banking services. The initiative operates through performance-based lending that rewards fiscal responsibility, environmental compliance, and governance improvements, rather than political alignment with American foreign policy objectives. Countries can access development financing based on their commitment to sustainable practices, rather than their willingness to support American strategic priorities. The competitive advantages are overwhelming for recipient nations. Canadian development financing carries lower interest rates than American alternatives, imposes fewer policy conditions than IMF programs, and provides longer repayment terms than commercial lending while supporting projects that serve national development priorities rather than American corporate interests. The demonstration effect accelerated adoption beyond Canadian projections. Countries that had struggled with American development financing discovered that Canadian alternatives offered better terms with fewer restrictions, while providing access to technologies and expertise that American programs typically withheld for competitive reasons. The third component represented the most direct challenge to American financial supremacy. Carney announced the establishment of the International Trade Settlement Network, presenting it as a mechanism for reducing transaction costs in international commerce while providing currency hedging services for small and medium enterprises. What he actually created was a comprehensive alternative to the SWIFT banking system that enables international trade without dollar transactions or American financial oversight. The network provides currency exchange, trade financing, and settlement services that allow countries to conduct international commerce while completely bypassing American financial institutions. The network operates through distributed ledger technology that ensures transaction security while maintaining privacy from American financial surveillance. Countries can trade with each other using their domestic currencies or alternative reserve units without requiring dollar conversion or American banking intermediation. The strategic implications for American financial control were catastrophic. The United States maintains influence over international commerce partly through its ability to monitor, restrict, or penalize transactions that flow through American-dominated financial systems. Alternative settlement networks eliminate this leverage while providing superior services at lower costs. The fourth component was the most subtle and most devastating. Carney announced the creation of the Resource Security Investment Trust, describing it as a mechanism for stabilizing commodity markets while providing inflation protection for institutional investors. This was actually a comprehensive strategy for capturing global flight to safety capital that has traditionally flowed toward American Treasury securities during periods of international uncertainty. The trust provides investors with exposure to Canadian resource assets, stable government bonds, and inflation-protected securities that offer superior returns with lower risks than American alternatives. The trust operates through a diversified portfolio of Canadian energy resources, critical minerals, agricultural land, and government securities that provide real asset backing rather than the deficit financing that supports American Treasury markets. International investors gain exposure to tangible assets rather than debt instruments backed by political promises. The investment advantages compound over time as resource scarcity increases the value of Canadian holdings, while American deficit spending reduces the purchasing power of dollar-denominated investments. The trust provides hedge fund performance with government security safety, while American Treasury bonds offer negative real returns adjusted for inflation. Central bank reserves began shifting toward the trust within weeks of its announcement as monetary authorities recognized that resource-backed securities provide better inflation protection than fiat currency bonds while offering superior long-term appreciation potential. American financial markets responded with immediate panic as institutional investors began reallocating portfolios toward Canadian alternatives that offered better risk-adjusted returns with superior asset backing. According to early indicators from Federal Reserve sources, foreign purchases of US Treasury securities declined by 40% in the month following Carney's announcement. The panic accelerated when major credit rating agencies began reassessing American fiscal sustainability in light of reduced foreign demand for Treasury securities. Moody's quietly initiated reviews of U.S. government debt ratings while Fitch began evaluating the long-term implications of declining reserve currency demand for American borrowing costs. Wall Street banks faced immediate earnings pressures as international clients began transferring assets to Canadian institutions, offering superior services with better regulatory frameworks. Goldman Sachs reported a 25% decline in international wealth management clients within 6 weeks of Carney's speech. JPMorgan Chase lost $180 billion in foreign deposits as international banks established Canadian correspondent relationships. American pension funds discovered that their international diversification strategies had become obsolete as foreign asset exposure through American financial institutions offered inferior returns compared to direct Canadian investment vehicles. The California Public Employees Retirement System began emergency portfolio restructuring away from dollar-denominated international investments toward Canadian resource-backed alternatives. Insurance companies that had relied on Treasury securities for regulatory capital requirements faced solvency challenges as declining Treasury values threatened their capital ratios. State insurance commissioners began allowing Canadian government securities as acceptable alternatives to U.S. Treasury bonds for meeting statutory requirements. The Federal Reserve's monetary policy transmission mechanisms faced systematic disruption as international demand for dollars declined, while demand for alternative reserve currencies increased. Interest rate adjustments that had traditionally influenced global financial conditions lost effectiveness as markets operated increasingly outside dollar-based systems. The cascade effects accelerated beyond American capacity to manage through traditional monetary policy responses. International banks began establishing Canadian operations to access stability reserve mechanism benefits. Multinational corporations started relocating treasury operations to Toronto to take advantage of trade settlement network efficiencies. The American response revealed the extent of financial vulnerability that Canadian alternatives had exposed. Within 72 hours of Carney's speech, according to unconfirmed reports from Treasury Department sources, emergency meetings were convened to assess the threat to dollar reserve status and American financial market dominance. Federal Reserve officials reportedly began urgent consultations with Canadian central bank counterparts about preventing further erosion of dollar-based international finance. The discussions included offers of enhanced cooperation agreements, shared regulatory frameworks, and joint policy coordination that had never been extended to foreign central banks. The Treasury Department initiated diplomatic approaches, offering Canadian financial institutions expanded access to American markets, regulatory exemptions that exceeded domestic bank benefits, and partnership arrangements that would integrate Canadian systems with American financial infrastructure. The desperation escalated when American officials offered to share sensitive financial intelligence, coordinate monetary policy decisions with Canadian preferences, and provide Canadian institutions with regulatory privileges that American banks had lobbied unsuccessfully to obtain for decades. The State Department launched parallel diplomatic initiatives offering comprehensive trade agreements, technology sharing partnerships, and strategic cooperation frameworks in exchange for Canadian commitment to maintain compatibility between Canadian financial innovations and American financial systems. Chinese officials recognized the strategic implications immediately and began competing aggressively for access to Canadian financial alternatives. Beijing offered technology sharing agreements, infrastructure investment commitments, and market access guarantees that exceeded anything China had provided to financial partners. The People's Bank of China authorized unprecedented cooperation with Canadian financial institutions, offering yuan Canadian dollar swap arrangements that bypassed the US dollar entirely in bilateral trade. Chinese state-owned banks received approval to establish major operations in Toronto, while offering Canadian banks preferential access to Chinese markets that American institutions had been excluded from accessing. Chinese sovereign wealth funds began massive allocations toward Canadian resource investment trusts, recognizing that commodity-backed securities provided superior inflation hedging compared to dollar-denominated assets. The China Investment Corporation committed over $200 billion to Canadian resource assets within 4 months of Carney's announcement. European Union representatives initiated their own diplomatic offensive, proposing integration between Canadian financial systems and European monetary frameworks, while offering regulatory harmonization that would facilitate Canadian financial services expansion across European markets. The competitive bidding for Canadian financial partnership demonstrated how completely Carney's strategy had transformed international finance relationships. Instead of Canada seeking integration with established financial centers, the world's major economies were competing for Canadian cooperation on terms that Canada would determine. Canadian financial institutions achieved unprecedented international expansion as global capital flows shifted towards systems that offered superior services with better risk management than traditional American financial centers. Toronto emerged as a major international financial center, while Montreal became a hub for resource-based investment services. The Bank of Canada gained influence over international monetary policy coordination that exceeded the Federal Reserve's historical authority, as central banks recognized that Canadian systems provided more stability with less political interference than American monetary policy frameworks. Canadian commercial banks expanded internationally through partnerships with foreign institutions seeking alternatives to American financial systems that had become unreliable due to political polarization and regulatory uncertainty that affected American banking operations unpredictably. The insurance and pension fund implications multiplied Canadian advantages, as institutional investors discovered that Canadian financial products provided better long-term returns with superior risk management compared to American alternatives that were increasingly subject to political volatility. The technology sector transformation followed as international companies recognized that Canadian financial systems offered advantages for managing global operations, international expansion, and cross-border transactions that American systems could not match due to regulatory restrictions and political complications. Sovereign wealth funds began establishing Canadian operations to access investment opportunities that American financial systems either restricted or subjected to political oversight that interfered with purely economic investment decisions. The cryptocurrency and digital asset implications provided additional advantages as Canadian regulatory frameworks facilitated innovation, while American systems created uncertainty that discouraged technological development and international adoption of advanced financial technologies. The mathematical inevitability of American financial decline became apparent as network effects accelerated the adoption of Canadian alternatives while reducing the advantages that had supported American financial dominance. Each institution that adopted Canadian systems reduced the value of American financial infrastructure while increasing the attractiveness of Canadian alternatives. The timeline for complete transformation of international finance was compressed by the superior performance that Canadian systems demonstrated compared to American alternatives that had become encumbered by political dysfunction, regulatory uncertainty, and competitive disadvantages that accumulated over decades of policy mismanagement. The geopolitical consequences are already becoming visible as traditional allies recognize that financial independence from American systems provides strategic advantages that outweigh the risks of reduced American cooperation in other policy areas. Countries that had organized their international economic strategies around American financial relationships began developing independent capabilities through Canadian partnerships, while reducing their exposure to American financial system vulnerabilities that could affect their national economic interests. The demonstration that systematic financial alternatives could eliminate dependence on American systems encouraged other nations to develop their own approaches to international finance, while reducing global reliance on American financial infrastructure that had become a source of instability rather than strength. The speed of international adoption reflected the mathematical reality that financial systems depend on efficiency, reliability, and profitability rather than political loyalty or historical relationships. Nations could not afford to accept inferior financial services to maintain American political approval when Canadian alternatives offered superior performance. Carney's strategic patience in developing financial alternatives reflected sophisticated understanding of how monetary systems create permanent competitive advantages through network effects that compound over time rather than dissipating through policy changes or political pressures. The October 12th speech that appeared to address routine monetary policy concerns actually announced the systematic replacement of American financial hegemony with Canadian financial leadership through voluntary adoption of superior alternatives rather than coercive displacement of existing systems. The 28 minutes that announced the end of American financial dominance demonstrated that comprehensive economic strategy can achieve in months what military force or political pressure required decades to accomplish, while creating more stable and beneficial outcomes for all participants, except the previous hegemon. The revenge that Carney engineered against American economic dreams was not emotional retaliation, but mathematical displacement of inefficient systems by superior alternatives that serve the interests of international users rather than American political objectives. American financial dreams of permanent hegemony collapsed not through dramatic confrontation, but through the patient construction of better alternatives that made American systems optional rather than necessary for international economic success. The most remarkable aspect of this financial transformation was how completely it escaped American strategic awareness during the critical development period. While American attention focused on political crises and military commitments, Canada was building financial infrastructure that could replace American systems entirely. The country that was supposed to remain a junior partner in North American finance had actually positioned itself to lead international financial innovation, while American systems became increasingly dysfunctional and internationally unreliable. Canadian strategic thinking in financial affairs reflects deeper understanding of how economic power actually functions in modern international systems compared to American assumptions about the permanence of advantages that depend on cooperation rather than coercion. The financial infrastructure that Canada developed represents irreversible competitive advantage, because other nations cannot replicate Canadian resource base, political stability, or institutional competence within timeframes that would allow effective competition with established Canadian systems. By the time American policymakers recognize the extent of financial system displacement that Canadian alternatives have achieved, the network effects will have made reversal mathematically impossible through traditional American approaches to international financial competition. The dreams that shattered were built on assumptions about American economic indispensability that had become false due to policy failures and strategic mismanagement that create opportunities for patient competitors to develop superior alternatives. Most Americans still don't understand that their country's financial dominance has ended. They assume that temporary market adjustments will restore traditional advantages without recognizing that systematic alternatives have made those advantages permanently obsolete. According to early indicators from financial development assessments, the advantages that Canadian financial leadership provides will become decisive and permanent within the current decade. Countries that establish Canadian financial partnerships will inherit capabilities that countries excluded from Canadian cooperation cannot develop independently. The quiet revolution in international finance has already begun reshaping global capital flows. monetary relationships, and economic opportunities in ways that most observers have not yet recognized. The transformation requires no dramatic institutional collapses, only the mathematical inevitability of superior systems displacing inferior alternatives through voluntary adoption. Carney's revenge represents the triumph of systematic competence over political dominance, financial innovation over institutional inertia, and strategic patience over tactical aggression. The dreams that died were fantasies about permanent hegemony that had become incompatible with economic reality.